after independence there was a lot of hope in Kyrgyzstan that a new age had come, and particularly because of the foreign policy that the President Akayev's government had pursued of seeking and gaining a significant amount of aid from all around the world. The idea was Kyrgyzstan was nicknamed the island of democracy. It's got a bright hope. In fact, the President Akayev, the former president, described Kyrgyzstan as the Switzerland of Central Asia, a mountainous, wealthy, progressive country. He hoped this would be the vision. This didn't come about for various reasons that were both beyond the control of Kyrgyzstan, difficult for it to develop and enrich itself in the global context it found itself in, but also because the government was perceived to have misused a lot of the aid and money that had come in, that the elites had enriched themselves and the poor had become more impoverished. So there was a general background of social and economic discontent, and this was true of all of the Central Asian republics by this stage. But what was particular about Kyrgyzstan was that opposition movements existed and were allowed to exist, were tolerated to a certain degree, which was not the case in Uzbekistan, where people were equally, if not more, poor. And so this relative freedom for opposition parties to organise, to conduct activities, to take part in elections, for genuine opponents of the president to win seats in parliament and run against him, meant that it was possible for elites to galvanise their supporters, who were generally on a regional basis or what's been described as a clan basis. And an early catalyst for the Tulip Revolution in 2005. In 2002, in Kyrgyzstan region of southern Kyrgyzstan, Aksi, where a parliamentarian, Bek Nazarov, was arrested and imprisoned on bogus charges, but his perceived crime was to campaign against a boundary agreement with China. The boundary between China and Kyrgyzstan had not been delimited. An early treaty had gone back 200 years, early treaties between Russia and China, and the President Akayev sought to finally delimit the boundary. It involved the transfer of some territory to China. Now, this was not an unusual issue in boundary disputes, and it was done peacefully. It was seen as part of cementing relations with a neighbouring power. But Bek Nazarov, part of the nationalist opposition, made a big issue of this. We can't give our sacred Kyrgyz land to China, and his opposition meant that the Kyrgyz government used basically politically motivated reasons to indict him, and he was imprisoned. And his supporters in his home region rose up, and a number of them were killed when they demonstrated. And this led to the resignation of the government eventually, and catalysed opposition, particularly in the south of the country. And from that period on, opposition became stronger and better organised. And eventually, it was from the south that anti-government elites were able to generate a large enough body that took over the regional administration buildings in Jalalabad and Osh, the two main regions of the south, and then marched on the capital. And they coalesced with local opposition movements in the north of the country, and large demonstrations surged eventually towards the White House, the government presidential administration, and the president made a decision not to use force. This is our best understanding, at least, that he decided this himself and fled the country, and so the government was toppled. So that was how that revolution came about. Yes, President Bakiev, who took power, it's very much business as usual. So there has not been a radical change in the way that Kyrgyzstani politics is run. But what has happened is been that the atmosphere of popular revolution, we can overthrow a president, has encouraged other people, opponents of Bakiev, former allies who've now turned against him, to try and attempt the same measures of demonstrations, of trying to seize control of regional buildings. And so this has led to more disorder in the country, and most worryingly, I think, there's been a rise in in criminality, the ability and power of organised gangs of certain elites to use violence to further their ends. So there've been the assassination of a number of high-profile MPs or political figures, and this was relatively new for Kyrgyzstan. In terms of natural resources, Kyrgyzstan has a certain amount of mineral deposits, not many, not substantial. In the Soviet Union it was mined for uranium, but its main deposit is, its main natural resource, I would think would be its water resources in its mountains. So it produces a substantial amount of hydroelectric power for itself and sells that on to neighbours at certain points. But this is a double bind for the country, because it's a mixed blessing, because most of the cotton that Uzbekistan grows in its Fergana Valley is irrigated by reservoirs which occupy Kyrgyz land. So this land is dammed up in the winter and released over the summer. And in the Soviet times this was one economy, it didn't matter. But in independence this has been a grievance for many Kyrgyz politicians, that the land is, that valuable Kyrgyz agricultural land is used to support Uzbek farming. So that's been one issue. I personally think that the greatest resource that Kyrgyzstan probably has, greatest potential for income, is tourism. It's spectacularly beautiful landscapes where one can engage in mountaineering or trekking or visiting or relaxing on some of the beautiful lakes like Issyk, which was a great tourist destination in the Soviet times. I think these would be substantial earners in the future. The difficulty in exploiting them has been people perceive the region as being dangerous, so Westerners don't come that often, the lack of a developed tourist infrastructure. One of the earliest drives of the Soviet Union was to emancipate, as they saw it, women. They saw women as under the subjugation of traditional Islamic elites, that if they could liberate them, they would break the power hold of certain groups and invested interests that they thought were holding back the development of the Soviet Union. So amongst the Uzbeks who live in Kyrgyzstan, who were a far more Islamic and devout society, the practice of full veiling occurred. So in the 1920s a campaign was launched to get women to burn their veils. And this was a period of great violence. Many women were killed for doing this, for example. But the legacy of the Soviet Union has been that it's sort of a liberal feminist model, that women were provided with reproductive rights, with a generous maternity leave, with access to healthcare, great push to incorporate them into education and politics. So they had a more prominent role in the academy, for example, by the 1980s than they had in the Western academy. And to an extent this legacy has continued. It's not something that can be undone easily. But amongst certain elements there has been a recovery of what's seen as an Islamic tradition, has been associated with new ways of regulating femininity. And so there has been an increase in the marriage of younger girls, younger women. And there has also been amongst the Uzbeks and amongst the Kyrgyz, who were less Islamic, they had a tradition of bride kidnapping, whereby where a man would see a woman on the street in some cases and kidnap her and force her to be his wife. And there's been a certain resurgence of that. It always existed. There's been a certain resurgence of that, and it's been justified in terms of recovering our Kyrgyz traditions. That's quite debatable. It was the extent to which it was practiced before the Soviet Union is debatable. It was probably only practiced by the wealthy. So that has been one significant factor that has re-emerged in Kyrgyzstan. But overall, the government has still pursued a policy of enforcing that there should be formal education for all boys and girls, that women have continued to be represented in politics and in education and other professions to a significant degree. There's a substantial school of thought in foreign and indeed in local, to an extent, international relations, international political science, that sees the relations of Central Asian states with the outside world as a zero-sum game. So in the early 1990s, there were numerous books written and articles published. Which direction will these countries go? Will they look to Saudi Arabia, to an Islamic model of statehood, or to Pakistan? Will they look to Russia, to China, to the West, to Iran? And I think the genius of President Akayev of Kyrgyzstan was that he did not follow that logic. He formed good relations with as many of his neighbours as he could. So he maintained good relations with Russia. He has pursued good relations with China as well, joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and seeking to develop relations with those countries. And it's often been pointed out that Kyrgyzstan, I think, is the only country with both a Russian and American military base. So this is symbolic of it, of the Kyrgyz perception that it can be friends with everyone. And so this has generally been the case. Since Bakirov took power, however, there's been a noted straining of the relationship with the USA, unpopularity about the behaviour of US service people on a couple of instances. There was a Kyrgyz national was shot and killed by a guard at the base, wasn't brought to justice under the Kyrgyz system, and this has been quite a catalyst for opposition. A certain hostility towards the Americans being there, and closer relations with Russia. But certainly nothing on the lines of Uzbekistan, which actually expelled the American base. So I think Kyrgyzstan has played it, for a small country, Kyrgyzstan has played its cards quite well. It's sought to be friendly with as many countries as it can, and to attract aid from as many countries as it can, which seems to be quite a sensible policy for a small country like Kyrgyzstan.